like I said, next week's the last week, which I find hard to believe. That's a good sign. That means time's going by quickly. Is there anything we've talked about in the last 8 weeks that you guys are concerned about or questions about that I can address now, or I will just jump into what we're talking about today? I think you guys are all quiet. Wow. That's a good thing, I guess.
Mike, do you
Yes.
do you have anything more you could add about whether mental illness, how important was mental illness to this very important family of Roosevelts?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that some of them suffered acutely from it. Eleanor's, and if it's not mental illness as identified today, it's not being able to handle issues in your life and compensating with other things. So, like, I think it's Eleanor's brother Hall was an alcoholic. Some of Teddy's kids really struggled with it. We know that Elliot Roosevelt literally drank himself to death. Her mother had some issues. And I think it's something we didn't talk about back then. Churchill called it, what did Churchill call it? The black dog. Mm-hmm. And Churchill suffered from depression his entire life. And back then, if you could find a way to get through it, that shows you were tough and really, but I think a lot of people were misdiagnosed. They didn't really know how to diagnose this stuff back then. Just stop whining and being a big baby kind of stuff. Why can't you suck it up? And to be part of the Roosevelt family, I think it's tough because you have, especially with Teddy, this whole strenuous life mentality. You just take the bull by the horns and go, go, go. And if you don't do that, you must be weak. You're not really a Roosevelt. And the same thing with the Kennedys and other people. I'll look to see if there's anything that really gets into the mental health issues with the Roosevelts. But clearly, you see depression popping up left and right. You see the kids. We'll talk about next week. The kids make their parents look like angels in some cases. And clearly, if you're married 5 times, a number of them were, you're not dealing with something. And is it just the pressure of being a Roosevelt? Christopher Kennedy Lawford, who was Peter Lawford's kid, wrote a book, and he talked about how tough it was to be a Kennedy and the mental health issues that come through and people's depression. Patrick Kennedy wrote a book a couple years ago about it, how he got into addiction to drugs, and it's compensating for something. David Kennedy, one of Bobby's kids, died of a drug overdose because he was in and out of mental institutions and struggling his whole life. But I think until recently, it's been kind of like this. Oh, well, just why can't you be strong like the rest of us? But I don't know I'll have to look to see if there's anything about the Roosevelts, particularly on that stuff. It's pretty clear there's some issues. So, it's sad.
And especially Teddy Roosevelt's excessive energy at times compared with other periods of depression.
Well, how do you, as a child of someone like this, how do you deal with being that person's child, right? I mean, one of my favorite books is a book called, I can't remember the name of it, but it's about the children of the civil rights movement leaders and how do you live being Martin Luther King's kids or Stokely Carmichael's kids or George Wallace's kids, or all across the spectrum of people involved in civil rights. So if you're George Wallace's kid, does everyone assume you're just a racist pig? Well, yeah, kind of, because you're George Wallace's kid. If you're Martin Luther King's kid, everyone kind of assumes you're just like your father. You're this great. But these kids, King's kids didn't know him very well. He was never home. And so they have to live up to this icon that they didn't know. But that's not their dad. So it's just been a struggle for them for years, And then let's talk to Martin Luther King III. He must know. He's grown up learning about his father post rather than during, because his dad was never home. The Kennedys are the same way. Remember John Kennedy Jr., the next heir to Camelot. That's incredible pressure. And the Roosevelts dealt with that too. Eleanor dealt with that too. I think sometimes you're Franklin's wife. Why aren't you more like Franklin? But she's not. And we'll get at that today. So I'll look into that, Kathy, and see if there's anything out there about mental health. There's got to be something, a paper at least, on them and mental health and depression.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah. You bet. That's what I'm here for. The good news is, other than the fact that you're almost done with me after 9 weeks, is that Mike Carter, particularly, and Gary Crocker, looks like there might be some baseball starting, we're hoping, in July. Nobody in the stands, but I'll take watching the games every day rather than nothing.
I guess so.
I was a bit disappointed, Mike, when I saw the comment from one of the players that they wanted to shorten the season and reduce the pay for the players. And his comment was, why would I do that? It's a greater risk and for less money. No, I'm not going to do that. I hope he doesn't get to play at all.
Is that a Yankees player? Do you know?
No, but he could be. He wants to be. You can tell.
All right. Off of baseball, let's talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, or as I like to call her, Mrs. Roosevelt.
Where'd you go?
What's that?
You're still. You're not moving.
Who's not moving?
You aren't.
I'm moving. Am I moving?
Not on your video.
You're moving here.
Yep. Joan, you're frozen up, actually.
Oh. How did I get that way?
I have no idea. Everyone else is moving.
Oh, okay.
Can you still hear me, though?
Yep.
Okay, good. One of the things I think we'll have access to this summer too, as the website gets rebooted and everything, is there's going to be some stuff on how to work with Zoom. I think there's some ideas about how to make that easier, because that's way above my pay grade. There are ways to learn how to do it that are relatively easy to do and not get too complicated. You don't have to press 55 buttons to make it work, but we'll try to make that available to people as well. So, well, as Kathy said, I think one of the interesting things about Eleanor, Mrs. Roosevelt, is her struggles right out of the gate with her family. There's a very famous picture of Theodore Roosevelt and his brother Elliot in a window of a house in Union Square in April of 1865, and the Lincoln funeral cortege is going by. And you see these two little boys in the window watching, probably their first inclination to be in public. And I'm sure Teddy was kind of pushing Elliot out of the way, and because it's Teddy. To be the brother of a president is difficult. To be the brother of Teddy Roosevelt in particular is difficult. As Alice Roosevelt, Teddy's daughter, said, he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral, which sums up a lot of how he thought and how he acted. And I think there's struggles with what is Elliot's place in society, what is Elliot's place in the family, and I don't think that portends well when he gets married and has a family. Eleanor's mother dies when she's very young. Her father dies not too long after that. By 11 years old, she's orphaned. And that's just got to be, I have no idea what that's like. And even growing up as a young girl, she's kind of different. She's quiet. She's very serious. Her mother calls her Granny. Not, I don't think, because of any particular how she looked, but just she was always so serious and quiet. But when you're like an 8-year-old girl and your mother's calling you Granny, that doesn't help. That kind of gives you a negative feeling about yourself. And, you know, oftentimes, as we've seen, a lot of Victorian families, the children are brought in a couple times a day to see their parents, and then nannies, people take care of them. There's not that much connection. So if your parents go before their time, that's got to be more difficult for you, because you don't really know them as well. Now, Eleanor loved her mother, and she loved her father. When he was in good health, there were multiple times together that she talked about and wrote about that she loved horseback riding and hiking and things like that. But then he would be off somewhere on a bender and struggling with other issues, and it was very difficult for her as a young girl. You know, family life is difficult in and of itself without adding mental health issues or alcoholism or whatever else happens. So I think she was paying attention. And I think she's one of these people that her parents are both gone by the time she's 11 years old. So she's afraid to love again. What if you love someone as much as she loved her parents, and they're taken from you so young and you see them struggling? Why would you want to do that again? You're just going to get hurt. So she's very hesitant, I think, throughout her life. Now, luckily, when she's a young lady, she gets sent to Allenswood School in England, just outside of London. This is a very progressive school, very forward-thinking, very positive thinking. And the headmistress of the school, Madame Soubestre, is a very renowned, progressive, ardent, an early feminist, as we call it, but had ideas that women had rights, women had a place in society, women could do whatever they wanted. And I think there's a connection between her and Eleanor that we see early on, that I think in some ways saves Eleanor's life. I mean, she could have been cast apart to other parts of the family and forgotten and discarded and not had her inner core explored by someone who respected her as a person, as a woman. And I think going to Allenswood for those years really gave her a sense of who she could be. She and Madame Soubestre stayed in touch till Madame Soubestre died, sending ideas back and forth about this or that. But I think if you're lucky enough to have a teacher who at some point in your life can help you discover who you really are, which is what teachers are supposed to do, right? Give you that sense of pride in who you are, what talents you have. And someone like Eleanor, who I think is a little more introspective than some people, to have a teacher like this, and not just a teacher, but the headmistress of the school, take you under their wing and kind of support you and ask you questions to help you explore who you might be and what you might think, and that your ideas about society aren't crazy. You're actually on the forefront of things. I think that's got to really help. When that time of school comes to an end, Eleanor goes back to New York. She has her debutante ball. How many of you went to a debutante ball? Anybody come out as a debutante? I never did. That's the thing of the past. But her debutante ball was at the Waldorf Astoria, of all places. Not a bad place to have a big party like that. And that's part of what society dictates. So she's been to Europe. She's done the schooling. She's learned. You know, those Europeans are a little crazy. And then she just come back and kind of go right back to society again, to kind of be the beauty of the ball. And people talk about, she was very tall. She was nearly 6 feet tall, long brown auburn colored hair, beautiful eyes. And when she engaged people, she enthralled them. But it was hard to get her to engage because she would tend to sit in the corner of the room and not be too conversant with folks. So she was very shy. And, you know, her life as a young woman in the Victorian age is to what? Have babies, get married, and keep the family going on. And as we know, down the road, her skills at motherhood weren't always the best. They weren't bad, but they were a little quirky. And this is something, there are always, and if you are a person of her social class and things, I think you have access to new studies and theories and research from doctors about what the best way to raise children is. We'll talk about that again in a minute. But her goal is, she may have been educated at Allenswood and know all this stuff, but she has to get married to somebody at some point, and that's what you're supposed to do. But who's that going to be? And I'm sure she meets all sorts of eligible young men. You know, the idea that you can marry someone who's good for you, good for your pocketbook, and you'll fall in love with him later. Kind of that idea of marrying well, and then hopefully if it all works out, you'll have kids, you'll fall in love. It's different than how we do it now. It's the other way around. You fall in love first, but then go into that, because it's a huge, as we all know, a huge commitment. So when she meets, she's known Franklin periodically over the years. They're cousins. They run into each other once in a while, but they really connect on a train ride up to upstate New York one day, and they click. There's something happens, and they talk and they talk and they talk and they talk. And then they keep talking, and they correspond, all in secret. You cannot let Mama know, because Mama has her own idea of who Franklin should marry, right? So they're not that dour, serious-looking Eleanor Roosevelt. That's just, she's part of the family anyway. What's up with that? But that's not uncommon either. So they keep in touch. They get secretly engaged. Sarah does what most parents who are opposed to something like that at that time would do. She sends them off. She sends Franklin off to get away for a while, hoping that some distance will cool the relationship. It doesn't. And when they get married, as we all know, Uncle Teddy came and gave the bride away. and they couldn't get married until he actually showed up, and he was late coming from the train station to the wedding in New York City because he was delayed by people all the time. I think Eleanor understood that. What are you going to do? The president's coming to give you away. That's just the way it goes. And at first, they went on a 3 or 4 month long honeymoon. Franklin was always flirting with the young ladies that they encountered. He got apparently some kind of psychosomatic reaction to being married because he broke out in a rash that they'd never been able to document if it was like touching poison ivy. He just seemed to get hives. Like his body was saying, "Oh my God, you're married." And I don't know if the honeymoon went really, really well. But in short order, she started doing what she's supposed to do and having kids. Franklin's the breadwinner. He's in law school for a little bit of time. He's a Roosevelt. She's a Roosevelt. But her job is to make a family happen. And children started happening rather quickly. Their first daughter is born a year after they got married in 1906. Her name's Anna. They're after Eleanor's mother. They will have 5 boys, one of whom the first Franklin Jr., who died within a few months of being born. They had 5 boys: James, Franklin, the second Franklin, Elliot, and John. So it's a pretty good sized family. And they're all boys. That's what we want in society. We want men. I just watched a whole documentary on Henry VIII and how his wife's inability to have a male heir drove all this stuff that happened, all these stories we know about Henry VIII, because, and when they finally did have a boy, that boy lived to be 15 years old and died. And then they changed everything so that a woman could be in charge. They'd forgotten their history of strong women leaders in the history of the world up before that point, like Cleopatra and Boudica, people like that. But it's all this male-dominated society. And that some of that carry over to society in America. Remember talking about the first week we talked about Eleanor had read about one way to give your children fresh air in the city, and they constructed a small cage and hung it out the back window. You can imagine how that would work today. The DFS would be at your house in about 2 seconds. But it's 1907, 1908. That's what she's read. It's just an odd thing to do. I think she really struggles. If you read books about her and read letters that she wrote and stories and things she talked about later, she really struggled being a mom in some ways. It didn't seem to be something she was necessarily good at. She kind of just did it. But she did a good job, I think, overall. But she struggled with it at times. And the kids didn't help as they grew older either. But she's also getting more and more involved in some social work ideas. She teaches for a while. When Franklin is Assistant Secretary of Navy, she goes down and works at St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital in D.C., which is a very well-known mental hospital. It's one of those, it's where John Hinckley was held for a number of years. And she goes down to work with the soldiers who have come back from the war and learns about PTSD and how they didn't have a term for that back then, right? But she understands that something's happened to these young men. Something's bothering them. They're seeing things they can't get out of their heads. And so she develops even then a really strong gift of sitting and listening, not coming in and tell them it's going to be okay and pat them on the back. You're going to be fine. But listening to them. What's going on? What do they talk? What do they see? They need clearly to unburden themselves of something they've seen. And she's the person to sit and listen to them. It's one of those early things she starts to do where she really takes that, and she does that the rest of her life, whether it's in the South Pacific or other countries she travels to. She's a great listener. And this is going to help Franklin later on in his career, because when he can't get around, she becomes literally his eyes and ears. When she discovers the Lucy Mercer betrayal in 1919, I think it's utterly destroying to her. It goes back to these fears she's had her entire life of being abandoned by someone she cares about. She loved her parents, they're gone. She loved Franklin, now he's out the door. I do love that picture that Will Carnahan showed us from Campobello a couple weeks ago of all of them on the stairs at Campobello. And Sarah has her hand on Eleanor's lap as if to say, it's going to be okay. which is kind of a change in their relationship because Mama dominated everything. Remember, Mama controlled Franklin's purse strings until the day she died. Mama's wedding present to them was a house that had adjoining doors so they could do everything they wanted together. Not. And so that's a change, I think, in how that relationship works, that Mama is actually reaching out to comfort Eleanor first. That Frank's on the other side of the picture, and he's clearly been chastised. And he knows he's done wrong, and Mama's like, well, I'm with your wife here now, so you just behave yourself. So after that, and after the vice presidential run, which Eleanor travels with him and sees how politics really works, Franklin, even though the Mercer affair is discovered and they've decided to move on, and I think there's more to this relationship than some people say. Hazel Rowley did a great job in her book, Eleanor and Franklin, and I watched a couple of different talks she gave online. I think there was a real love there. There's so much love there that it allows them to have the freedom to be who they really are. You're not trying to constrain the other person because you're afraid of something or you don't like that. Clearly, the physical aspect of the relationship was done. It seems like it was done before this was discovered. A lot of Victorian women like, well, we've had 6 kids. I'm done. Rose Kennedy was like, see ya. You've had 9 kids. That's my job. And, marital relations were kind of a burden in some way. Eleanor talked about it being kind of a burden. So I don't think it's this, she discovered this thing and that was the end of that romantic part. I think they'd kind of moved on from that part anyway. But I think there really is a depth to this relationship that we don't give them credit for. That there's a total love of the other person that allows them the freedom to be who they are. And you're not threatened by that anymore. Well, that's just what I've come up to think of in the last couple of months reading about these folks. When he gets polio in 1921, it's not a nurse who takes care of him initially. It's Eleanor. It's Mrs. Roosevelt. She sits and bathes him and feeds him. For a while, he can't even move his arm. He's paralyzed up to the neck initially. He can't even lift his hands. She changes his catheter. She wipes his backside. That is not the actions of someone who can't stand their husband. And that's love and compassion. Because she instinctively knows this is the most humbling thing you've ever had to go through. And she's right there the entire time. Now, after a while, she has things to do, so she can't do that all the time. She has a family to keep raising, so they do hire a nurse. But initially, she could have hired a nurse at the beginning, but she didn't. She stayed with Franklin because she knew how important it was. I think on her own, she's got to be petrified now because she's lost him in that I'm in love with you thing a few years ago. Now she may lose him completely. So she's panicked. She's got to be panicked. Once his system's calmed down and he's kind of beginning to recover, she can get back to her life and help him out. Because during this time, she meets some of the women who become some of her closest friends. In 1922, she met Marion, Dickerman, and Nancy Cook. These were very much on the forefront, women on the forefront of progressive ideas. They lived together. And, it's one of those things when you read the earlier stuff and the stories and how they frame those stories in the earlier books about the Roosevelts, nowadays, you're like, oh, they were a lesbian couple. And it's no big whoop-de-doo. But back then, 50 years ago, it's like, how do you phrase that? They were very good friends. We had friends of ours in Cheyenne that went to Canada to get married. And we were good friends of ours, but they were always very thankful to Amy and I. What did we do? Because we treated us like we were people when we got married. Everybody else talks like, you guys are just very good friends. Like, no, you're a couple. You got married. And we were the few. It doesn't take much to just treat people as people. And Eleanor saw these women as just people. They weren't lesbian activists. They weren't this. They were her friends. They were the ones that with her bought, and Franklin helped them buy a little bit of land east of Hyde Park of the Springwood estate that they called Valkill. That was Eleanor's getaway place. We all have those places we need to go to sometimes just get out of town. And she could go there, and the two of them lived there as well, and they started their own furniture making factory. Kind of as an example of kind of a utopian idea in society that you could push some ideas and show how people could come together to make products that could be sold locally. It's like, I'm gonna put out a plug. Mr. Crocker there had mentioned before, Fast Eddie's restaurant, drive-in out in Winthrop. You know, John likes to go to Applebee's once a week or so just to get a burger. Tell you what, go local. I mean, that's what they would do. Local is they could have had furniture in town that came to a department store, but it's how much nicer is to have local furniture being made by women and people who live there, who you know. So local becomes this idea of putting money into the economy that they're there for, which is great. She spends a lot of time with these women. They expose her to a number of different social ailments that are happening in the world. She gets to go into the city and really see how other people are living. She's seen some of this before, but her eyes are really opened to how the other half lives. And Franklin, who's trying to keep his political career up, needs someone who can go for him and see these things. And so Eleanor and Louis Howe, his devoted chief of staff, I guess you'd call him, spend months and months and months traveling around the country talking to people. Franklin keeps up with these people. And Eleanor and Louis show up, and they drive down into upstate New York, out in the west part of the state. They drive to Pennsylvania. They drive to New England. They drive down south to see how people are living, because Franklin can't. And she writes back, and she's talking about things, and she's seeing things, and she's got to be coming up and saying, well, frankly, you know, they said this in the paper, but don't believe them. This is what I'm really seeing on the ground is this. And I think that's such, it's not just a thing for her or for him, I mean, but it's an opening of her spirit and her soul, and it's got to be a kind of a feeling of, yeah, this is what I'm here for. This is what I was born for, was to help people, to reach out. And thank God I have this opportunity to do this. My husband has the wherewithal and the connections to do these things. And I can do this and be my own person and discover that there are people that need to be taken care of. And I can have an impact through my husband and his political connections. And that becomes more and more true when his career takes off, when he becomes the governor of New York. She travels around the state. This is about the time she meets Lorena Hickok, who's a reporter. And clearly, Eleanor Roosevelt falls in love with her. There's a void in her life that is picked up by this woman. The letters between them are wonderful. They're very touching. There's a hint of naughtiness in these letters a little bit. But they're clearly two ladies who have fallen deeply in love. They spend a great deal of time together. They take a 3-week trip, I think we talked about a couple weeks ago, throughout New England, and no one knows who they are. This is when she's first lady, and they give her, she knows how to fire a gun, how to shoot a gun, which I have a hard time. Eleanor Roosevelt, who's this beautiful, amazing person with such a focus on human rights and peace and understanding, she could kill you. She knows how to use a gun. They trained her how to use a gun. She was taught how to use a gun by her bodyguard, Earl Miller. We talked about him before. He was this very handsome state trooper who had worked for Al Smith and stayed around with the Roosevelts. And clearly, Eleanor, she's very compartmentalized, and she apparently loves people with all her heart and soul, sometimes at the same time. Clearly, she has a relationship with Earl Miller that is very dramatic and very, it's very profound. So profound that society wags are talking about this and it gets to the point that Earl Miller marries 3 times. Every time to people much younger than him. He dated Missy LeHand, but he's trying to get out of this, oh my God, people think you're Mrs. Roosevelt's boyfriend idea. Of course, none of them work, because he's really not in love with them. He's in love with Mrs. Roosevelt. She's clearly, there's some connection. We don't have a lot of letters and things like that, like we do with Lorena Hickok and Eleanor. We have letters between the two of them, and you can read how they felt for each other. Earl Miller, we get kind of the kids, Elliot Roosevelt in particular said, well, yeah, he was the greatest love of her life, kind of idea. Okay. But clearly there's something there. But she and Lorena drive, and they don't get recognized. I got to find out what town in Maine they get to. It was probably Monmouth, because those people down there that go to the academy are wicked sharp. Or maybe it's Hollowell, I don't know. Certainly wouldn't be Manchester. We're just a roadway that goes through every place. But somehow they get recognized. Can you imagine the First Lady of the United States driving around and no one recognized her for 3 weeks? And that just boggles my mind. Now, of course, we don't have all the social connections we do now. So there's maybe not as many pictures of her everywhere. No one has really known what she looks like when she becomes first lady. But it's pretty wild to think she could drive around, she and her friend Lorraine Hickok and their gun, and not be recognized for 3 weeks. That's just a different time, so to speak. As First Lady, she is very involved with continuing her Eyes and Ears campaign for Franklin. She's involved, she joins a labor union. You all know the story of her and Marion Anderson, who was going to, they were have her sing at the Constitution Hall, the DAR's Constitution Hall there in D.C., and they said, nope, sorry, that ain't going to happen. I think that's ironic that they wouldn't let Marion Anderson sing because she was black, but we saw a stand-up concert that Robin Williams did about 5 years ago at the same place. So you won't let someone in who's black, which is the guy who's got a potty mouth like there's no tomorrow, perform. So they've got some issues on how they handle people. And what did Mrs. Roosevelt do? She found another venue for her. And thousands of people showed up. And if there's actually video clips, if you go on chance and look, there's video clips of Marion Anderson singing. What a voice. What a voice. Another time, Mrs. Roosevelt was in Birmingham, Alabama at a women's conference. And the people that set up the conference put black women on one side and white women on the other. You know where Mrs. Roosevelt sat? Right smack in the middle. And that was too much. One of the people that couldn't believe that was a police officer by the name of Bull Connor. If you all know anything about the civil rights movement, later on, Bull Connor shows up again 30 years. He's the guy with the dogs in Birmingham, turns the hoses on the demonstrators. So he shows up with that story. So she's involved in that sort of stuff all throughout. And the president is, we talked about this in the Monday class, it's a struggle for him because she's more progressive on things, but she can be that way. She's not an office holder. She doesn't have to be beholden to the office, to the electors of these people. And so FDR, who I think wants to do the right thing, sometimes has to be held back because he's worried about how if I push this too much, what are the conservative Democrats in the South going to do on other bills that I have? It's a game. It's a compromise thing. As president, you have to do. Kennedy had to do that. Johnson had to do that. Even Franklin Roosevelt had to do that sometimes. Had to drive the two of them to battle at sometimes because she's much more forward thinking on these things than he is. But sometimes he can't do it, just politically speaking. It's just not the thing to do right then. I'm not excusing it or condemning it. It's just the way that the beast is of being president. Gary?
Just a quick comment. If you watch the movie Lincoln, you can see that same kind of compromise, and obviously the great emancipator, he wanted to do a lot of great things, and he did a lot of great things, but he had to play some awful games. And it's politics. That's how it works.
It's government. But I always loved that in that movie, one of my favorite lines is the abolitionists are like, oh, Lincoln's not going to do anything. Blah, 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 blah. And Thaddeus Stevens, who's as righteously indignant as anyone who ever served in the Congress, says, I want you to understand something and wrap your minds around this, basically. Abraham Lincoln, the great dawdler, he calls him, has asked us to join him in a fight to end slavery. How we get there, that's one thing. The fact that he's on that road is really important. And don't lose sight of that fact. Don't drive people away because they're not acting fast enough for you.
Right.
Bring them in. I remember once in Wyoming, I was working in political stuff out there, and there was a bill in front of the House to allow, at the time, God, this was 2005 or something like that. And if you were a gay couple, came through Wyoming, and one of you got sick, the partner could not necessarily make medical decisions for you or even go in the room with you. It was that kind of attitude. And they were trying to get a bill passed to allow that to happen. Just think of how we have now. We went from that to civil unions to marriage now. And I remember going to a hearing about this issue for the House Judiciary Committee. And there were people on both sides screaming and yelling. And there were people in there with these signs attacking people on their side for not being progressive enough and yelling at them. And I said, why don't you go ask that representative why he's opposed to your bill right now? Just talk to him at recess. Just ask him a question. And besides, you're going to get tossed out of here for holding signs. You can't have signs in here. You're going to lose your right to even participate if you don't just, there's rules for a reason. They went and talked to him. found out what his concerns were, worked with him on that. He changed his vote, and the bill got to the next level. So it sometimes it seems horrible and not right that they have to do that, but sometimes it's how things work. Compromise a little bit here, a little bit there. So Eleanor has the benefit of not being president in that sense, that she can be, and I think it's her. And Franklin maybe isn't. I haven't found anything on his deep inner feelings about civil rights. I think he's more progressive than Hoover or other people that come before, but even Johnson wasn't quite there yet. And Kennedy, it's a process. So she's involved in those things. She joins the NAACP. She's on their board of directors. One of my favorite stories is about her going to the South Pacific, because if you're an admiral or a general and you're trying to advance your troops in battle and you find out the First Lady's coming to visit, that's going to be a pain for you because you have to kind of reorganize everything and strategize everything and organize security because the First Lady's coming. This isn't like, the mailman's coming. This is the First Lady. And Admiral Halsey in particular, Bull Halsey, who does not suffer fools, was like, oh my God, we have to stop and put it in. After she came and went, he said that was the best thing for morale he'd ever seen in his entire career. She was there for like 3 days. And she would do that. She would go in and sit and talk to men, listen to them. They would say, I don't think I'm going to make it. Can you give this letter to my girlfriend? And some people would go, yeah, sure. And they take it and give it to an aide. She put it in her purse, and she'd make sure that letter got to the girlfriend or the family member. So she follows through on this stuff. I think it's absolutely amazing. A lot of stuff to do. That's what sets her apart, I think, is this connection she has with people. It had to be absolutely horrible for her to find out when the president died that Lucy Mercer was there, that Anna had helped facilitate these meetings, and that she'd been around for a while because Franklin had sworn he wouldn't do that anymore. That was done. But clearly there's a connection that is missed there as well, that he needs someone to just laugh with him and take his mind off it, which is why Anna, I think, facilitated these things. Because even Anna and the kids said that sometimes Eleanor didn't know when to stop. She would be like, oh, we need to do this. And he's like, I got to deal with Stalin. We got to do this. You got to do this. And he's like, oh my God, stop it. And he needed someone who could kind of let him break away from that. That was Anna's justification for helping, I think. But again, if you think your husband's been off that path for a long time, and to find out, and I don't think there's any erotic love like that with Franklin and Lucy at this point. She's just a person from his past who helps him think of better days, and allows him a chance to just be free and open for a while and relax. But I don't think Eleanor sees that when she gets to Warm Springs and finds out that she's been there for a couple of days. That had to just destroy her again. Well, what does she have to do then? She has to go then and be the First Lady and process out with the casket and go on the train to Washington and then go to New York and perform this role. But I think it's very telling that within a week after this, she was encountered by a couple of reporters, and they said, how are you doing, Mrs. Roosevelt? She said, well, the story's over now. She thought she was done. In some ways, she was just getting started. President Truman, who, as we all know, was a tough, straight-talking guy from Missouri. Remember his first encounter with Mrs. Roosevelt after the president died was he went to the White House and he sees her and he says, Mrs. Roosevelt, he's being very solicitous and kind. Is there anything we can do? I'm very sorry. She said, no, Harry. Is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one who's in trouble now. And one of the first things he finds out, oh, Mr. President, we have this atomic bomb program we're working on. Like, what? What does that do? Let us tell you about it. One of the things, before I forget, Eleanor's done almost her entire career as First Lady. She continues to do until up before she dies, is she writes a column called My Day, which is a platform to talk about her role as First Lady, but talk about the issues that she's encountering, the people she's meeting, and where the country can go to make progressive changes on things. And Lorraine Hickok helps her write this. She and Hick's relationship changes. They go from being deeply in love to being very good friends, as sometimes relationships will do. You're lucky if you can still be friends with your early boyfriends and girlfriends and people in your life. That's a great thing to be able to continue those on. They remain friends till Eleanor dies. So she writes this column all the time, My Day. You can still go on. Somebody looked on Monday how many columns she wrote. There's thousands of them. You can go and Google them and read them. I mean, they're out there. They've been preserved. Just, they're funny stories. They're kind of like a Eleanor Roosevelt version of Tales from West Gadsden, Maine. They're stories to kind of keep people thinking and processing stuff and reminding of their past, where they can go, what it's like to be First Lady. So she doesn't quite disappear. Even when she says the story's over, she's still doing her column. But President Truman knows a smart person when he sees one, and he asks her to be on the part of the UN team that's going to negotiate the UN. I talked about this the other day in a Facebook posting because it reminded me when I was in college. I went to Bethel College in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, and that House district, the congressional candidate that year in 1986 was Harold Stassen. Anybody remember Harold Stassen? He was the boy governor of Minnesota. He was elected when he was 36 years old, served a couple of terms, served in the war, came back, almost beat Dewey in 48 for the nomination for president. But before that, he was a signatory of the UN Charter. And by the time I met him, he had kind of lost his luster and was wearing a horrible toupee, and people thought he was kind of a joke. But a friend of mine was like, oh my God, that's Harold Stassen. We went over, no one else was talking to the guy. Went over and sat down and talked to him. I was like, we got the chance to talk with him, who was a governor, signed the UN Charter. That's an amazing thing in and of itself. And all these other things. What a chance to sit around and just, you get those chances once in a while, not all the time, once in a while. So Eleanor is asked to be part of a process of drafting a Declaration of Human Rights. Did any of you get a chance to look at it?
Yes.
Yeah. What I know Joan did. She read. How many pages is it when you print off, Joan? Like
8.
8. What thoughts on the Declaration that you all read?
What?
What do people have thoughts about it?
Well, I think it's a wonderful commentary of the goals that people had back then.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I actually thought it was ahead of its time.
Okay.
Seems sad that it's still so relevant and unachieved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody else? No one?
Mike, I just don't understand. See, my whole life, living most of my life so far in Central Maine, I guess we're in somewhat of a bubble.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I served in Vietnam, so I've traveled some and I've seen some not so good things and whatever. But still in my heart and in my head, I still think people can be and should be and would be good. But then I keep bumping into people who act so terribly to each other, treat each other badly for no reason at all, except either their gender, their color, their sexual preference, their and I'm just baffled by it. I am baffled by it. I remain baffled. I will be baffled my whole life.
Yeah, let me look up a book I think you guys might be interested in picking up sometime. I loved it because, like you said, it's very forward thinking. It's very much, I think Gary's right, ahead of a document ahead of its time. It's clearly based on our Declaration. There's some strains between the two of them. But it gets at, and we've all talked about, there's things in there that we've never seen realized, even to this day. But how difficult that is to be in those shoes. And she had a lot of hard times to get. Part of the problem was she goes in to talk about these things, and she's a woman, so all these guys are like, well, dude, come on. What does she know? She's a woman. Lucky there are women from around the world who were just coming into power then, as the colonial cloaks are thrown off. We've talked about before, one of the problems that Roosevelt and Churchill had was their view on how the world should progress after the war. And Franklin saw it as a way to get rid of all this colonial stuff. And Churchill's like, well, we're going to keep our stuff going on. This is what makes us an empire. So it's a real struggle of how do you do that? How do you let people have their countries back where they've been dominated by foreign powers, whether they be French in Vietnam or the English in India? How does that work? And being a diplomat like that and being Mrs. Roosevelt, you have to get past this male chauvinist attitude that what does she know? She's a woman. but I think they do that at at their peril, because she's smarter than almost all of them. She knows how to negotiate better than almost all of them. She has that last name. She charms half of them to the point they give in. And she's dealing with guys like John Foster Dulles, who's not a pushover, but he finds himself more than once, I think, outfoxed by her in the process of getting things done. Samantha Power, who was the UN ambassador under President Obama, wrote a fascinating book called The Education of an Idealist. The Education of an Idealist. And I would recommend anyone read that, because it's a great story. It's a wonderful written book, and what a great story she's had. But how do you balance this idealism with the practicalities of what's on the ground? There's a documentary about it. I think they did it. She did. What did she do? Google her, because there's a documentary about some of the work she did as in the foreign policy realm. One time being as part of a UN group in Africa, I think it was, and that convoy accidentally hitting a young child in the area where they were working, and how horrible it felt that there was an accident. You're trying to help people, and then you actually kill one of them with one of the cars. I think the kid ran out in front of one of the cars. That's just a microcosm. But if you want to see how tough it is to be an idealist and then be a practical person, which Eleanor had to do, I mean, these are all goals for us. And you're right. There's some of these things have not been attained yet. Some of them have been attained and taken back. One of the things she really worried about was the right of people to move around the world. We've seen what that's done. You've seen what that did to people in Italy. You see what they've done in Germany. When you have people who aren't German, they show up.
That's the real problem.
Right.
The real problem is you have the idealists who think that the people in power in those countries should be happy to give it up. And you have the people in the countries having to adapt a system that maybe none of them want handed to them.
And so it's adapting, and it's compromising, and it's working, and it's realizing, and it's negotiating.
Yes.
Samantha Power talks in her book, and I really, if you want to read a fascinating book over the summer, it's well written, and you get this sense of just how difficult it is.
Yeah.
We're not talking at the U.S. level, how tough that is, but put that in the world level, and you got even more sensitive people than you do in Congress.
Right.
You got leaders and prime ministers and queens and kings and whatever.
Yeah.
And how tough it is that these are a great set of goals, and we have to keep working towards them. I actually printed up a copy of that, a very small, and hung it on the bulletin board. So look at once in a while, just, women's rights, children's rights, rights of people to move around, rights. We don't have to do another war like this to get to this point.
What was Samantha Power's book called?
The Education of an Idealist.
Okay. Thanks.
She wrote a book on genocide called A Problem from Hell back in the 90s. And that's one that I usually take a break to read. I read that book in like 24 hours. I couldn't stop reading. It was so good. And she won the Pulitzer Prize for it. She's a brilliant activist, scholar, diplomat.
Wow.
Problems
of what? Genocide?
It's called A Problem from Hell.
Problem from Hell. Okay.
Now, Mrs. Roosevelt also, after the UN, she spoke and continued her stuff. Someone asked in the Monday class what the connection was to, there was a connection to the civil rights movement and the UN. And there are a couple actually pictures I found yesterday. I'll hold these up. If you look, this is a gentleman marching from Selma. Look behind the American flag. That's a UN flag. Same here, Dr. King. There's a UN flag. Mrs. Roosevelt was very much in tune with the movement. She said of Dr. King at the Montgomery bus boycott, what did she say about him? I think it's absolutely fascinating. King's insistence that there be no hatred in this struggle is almost more than human beings can achieve. King's insistence that there be no hatred in this struggle is almost more than human beings can achieve. Clearly, she admired him. She met Rosa Parks. She spoke at the Highlander School in Tennessee, where King had been. Rosa Parks had been learning how to be an activist. There were bulletin boards all over the South of Dr. King in a classroom at the Highlander School. It said, M.L. King at Communist Training School. So anything progressive was labeled a communist. You hear that kind of down in South Africa back during the apartheid years. If you're not with us, you're a communist. So she stays involved in those types of things. She's very much in support of the civil rights movement. Clearly, there's a connection, I think, between the Declaration of Human Rights and what's in there. And people saw the civil rights movement as a natural offshoot of that. It just happened to be here in the U.S. So human rights are human rights no matter where you go, and the U.S. doesn't get to just pretend like they're not part of this situation. One of the people wrote to, I can't remember who they wrote to, somebody wrote to the governor of Alabama or something like that, President Johnson, I think, after that movement, and was just screaming that they allowed a UN flag. They're taking over the world. The UN is taking over everything. That's just not American. They don't clearly see where the connection is. Okay. Hang on one second. Okay. So I think it's fascinating that there is this connection with people like that. She stays involved in politics. She supports very openly Adlai Stevenson in 52, 56, and supports him in 1960. And she's very involved. She knows people. She knows how to pull the levers of power. She often says, well, I don't know anything about politics. Yeah, right. Okay, whatever. She stays involved in those sorts of things. In 1960, Adlai's kind of thinking about running again. She's really pushing him. She's not in favor of this young upstart from Massachusetts, for sure, with all the hair. She doesn't like his dad because Joe was an appeaser and was not, at the end of his career, on good terms with the Roosevelts. And she thinks he's just wet behind the ears and doesn't know anything. So after the convention, when he's the nominee, she still hasn't endorsed him yet. And timing of endorsements can be really key. And she invites him to come meet her at Hyde Park at Valkill. And Kennedy's smart enough to know he needs to kind of make inroads with that wing of the party. He'll go up to meet her. The day before he's supposed to be there, one of her grandchildren is killed in a horse accident. And Kennedy says, well, I don't need to come. But she said, no. You've got things to do. Let's get together and we'll talk about this stuff. And he comes up there and she's very gracious and they have tea in her living room. And Kennedy comes out of the meeting and he's got this smile on his face. Staff aides talked about he was totally smitten with her. There was something about her that just melted down his Brahmin reserve. There's pictures of the meeting. He's just like this. When he comes out, he's just grinning ear to ear. She just charmed the socks off him. And she endorsed him right after that. She used to call him the boy, but she didn't talk about him after that. She listened to his brain, knew what he was thinking, what he was processing through, thought he was the best hope for the country, and endorsed him. But he went in for that meeting that turned into longer than a quick half hour and came out just totally in love with the woman, like so many people were when they met her. Like Admiral Halsey, right? Other people in the past who just, John Foster Dulles, who there's something there that you don't think is there, but wow, she's incredible. He appoints her to some commissions later on in her life. By the time, at this point in her life, in the 1960s, she's in another relationship. She's had a private doctor for a number of years, and this doctor was introduced to her by the wife of a dear friend of hers who wrote the books Eleanor and Franklin and Eleanor, The Years Alone, which is a great book by Joseph Lash. His wife Trudy, and she met Dr. Gurwitch, who had immigrated to this country as a young man, got his medical degree, and had been recommended to her, and he became her personal physician. He also became her traveling companion and traveled with her all over the world. There are many photographs of her meeting Khrushchev and other people like that in the late 50s, early 60s, and David Gurwitch is right behind her. He's there all the time. He became her doctor, but the letters between the two of them are very effusive, particularly her letters to him. Things like, I've never known love like this before. She's 7 years old. He's in his middle 50s. There's something going on. We don't have letters from him as much. And I wish, my plan was to have, there's a wonderful book that his widow wrote about their relationship called Kindred Souls. But of course, we can't go to the state library right now, so I don't have access to it. But when he got married to a young woman who was an art connoisseur in New York, they actually lived in the same apartment as Eleanor did. She lived one floor above them. Kind of an interesting relationship. But that's her whole life. She's got Franklin and Mama. She's got David and Edna living in the same building. She's got Marion and Nancy. She's got Lorena. She's got Earl. She's not a person, I don't think, who puts relationships into a box. They're free flowing and they're open. And these people aren't, when they end, if there's any kind of romantic part of the relationship, when they end, there's no bitterness, there's no hatred. There's just it's a blessing to have this person around in your life. But I think it's absolutely fascinating that, again, here she's allowed herself at the end of her life to love someone again, to open herself up, to get some of that, I think, joy and happiness from having someone around who could help you. A, he's her doctor, but B, clearly there's a deep attachment there. That I think, I wish I had the book to tell you more about it, but it was very unique. Towards the end of her life, she realizes that she is getting sicker. She's not well. She does go to Campobello. Remember, they talked about in our video session that she was the first person to go across the bridge from Maine into Campobello. That remained one of her last trips was to Campobello, and there are great pictures of her. I'll see if I can find one. Where she just really enjoyed. Now here's Jack and Eleanor. He's pretty intently listening to what she has to say. But there's other pictures when they come out of the meeting. He's just grinning from ear to ear. This is one of people's favorite pictures of her. Right here. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Carrying her own suitcase, coming out of the train station in D.C. No bodyguards, no security. She might still have her 38 in that bag. You never know. But she was connected with things her whole life. She was connected with people, and she gave of herself completely to those folks. Some more than others, and they gave of themselves completely to her. She got relatively seriously sick very quickly in the fall of '62 and died in November. Here's a picture of all the presidents. You don't see pictures like this very much. Presidents don't all get together very much. You got Jack and Jackie and Lady Bird and Lyndon and Harry and Dwight and Bess all together. There aren't a lot of people that get that kind of attention. Eleanor Roosevelt.
What was Eleanor's illness at the end?
It was leukemia, I think. I think that's the diagnosis. It was a form of it was a blood disease. Let me look. Let me look. Oh, it was aplastic anemia. So not leukemia, aplastic anemia. I have no idea what that means. I'm not a doctor, and my doctor is not home, so I can't tell you. Anyone else knows what that is?
I know what it means, Mike.
Okay.
Aplastic anemia is when your bone marrow is in disarray and it can no longer make white cells or red cells or platelets.
And it was very quick when she was diagnosed, and it took her very quickly, but she couldn't do anything. She had a TV show she did called The American Experience, which I think is, I'd be curious to know if the modern PBS show took that name because of that. But she had people on. She was supposed to have Dr. King on, but she got sick and went to the hospital and went home and passed away. There has been kind of a reassessment of her because you need to look at her life in its own framework, I think. Joseph Lash wrote a book. Blanche Wiesen-Cook, who I met, she was at UMaine years ago talking, wrote a 3-volume study of Eleanor. I think it's fascinating because the 3rd volume covers 22, her last 20 years, and it's the thinnest of the 3. I think in some ways what she did in her last years after Franklin died were the most important years that she had on Earth. She certainly had some of the biggest impact. She wrote her own books. She wrote a couple different versions of her autobiography. Always, I gotta tell you, I love the smell of old books. A little musty, but that's good for you. So there was an article I picked up, I read from the Atlantic, that was a speech she gave called "What Happened to the American Dream." It's interesting to read because some of the stories she talks and examples she cites are things that we're still dealing with today. Things haven't changed so much. Some things have changed and some things haven't. Another article about when they made that movie a couple years ago called Hyde Park on Hudson, and it focuses primarily on the Roosevelts entertaining the King and Queen of England when they came. And Eleanor's biggest problem is concerning what to serve with the hot dogs. She doesn't have much of a role in that movie. And the author of this article said, we need to give her more, a better story. And I agree. There was a TV miniseries TV movie back in the 80s with Maureen Stapleton, who played Edith on All in the Family, called Eleanor, First Lady of the World, and it really details her role in getting the UN Declaration of Human Rights established. But there hasn't been. I think she's a woman that needs her story told in a much more fuller sense. I don't know who does that. It's hard to do that when the movie's primarily about Franklin and his health, like Warm Springs or Sunrise at Campobello. She becomes kind of a secondary character. And I always feel bad too because they have to like find a way. Like when Cynthia Nixon played her in that movie, they had to shove fake dentures into her face to kind of make her look like she had that lower lip that was almost. Or you have Greer Garson, who's very beautiful, and they have to kind of, in their minds, make her look like she's playing or whatever. So it's a hard role to do because there's so much of the physical proximity of things you have to do. It's the same thing with playing Kennedy. You have to have the hair right. You have to have the smile. Dick Nixon, you have to have the widow's peak. Whatever you have to, because people think they know these people. They've seen them so much. It's so much part of their lives. But I think her story is unbelievably compelling and touching and amazing. And maybe there's a class down the road I can do just on her. I don't know. But clearly we need more scholarship on her and more writing about her and more stories about her and the dynamics. I'd love to see a book about her and Earl Miller. There's a book about her and Sarah and their relationship and how difficult that could be at times. But I think women's history in and of itself is coming more to the fore in the historical world. People are taking that one on and writing more about it and researching more about it and telling the stories more, which is fantastic and something we need. And she's one I think I'd love to see a movie about her somewhere. So, any questions for anybody? Mr. Crocker.
Mike, I'm curious, this goes back a little bit in our conversation, but you said that she was the first person to cross the International Bridge when it was constructed between Maine, Lubec and Campobello.
Yep.
Was that the last trip she took to Campobello?
Yes.
Just pretty soon, my class online is just getting over, and I'd have to go out and move a few things. So maybe in half an hour or so.
I can't mute her for some reason.
Okay. Hi, Patricia. Thank you. Bye.
Hey, Joan.
Hey, what?
I can't mute you from here for some reason. Can you mute yourself?
I can't do anything.
Oh, we just heard your whole phone conversation.
Yeah.
Good luck.
I'm sure you did. No, I'm gonna try to fix. I'm gonna try to fix it after I didn't want to lose the program at all, so I'm gonna wait until I'm done with it. You're done, and then I'll see if I can straighten it out.
Yeah, Gary, I think that was her last trip.
Okay.
Clearly, that was her building. That was her home.
Yep.
But she liked it more than Franklin did.
Well, I think for Franklin, he went there 3 times after the polio. I think that was the place. You don't want to go there. That'd be like buying a house near where you had a car accident.
Yeah.
It's too painful.
But I can tell you, I know you've visited. If there's anyone on this call that has not visited Campobello, you need to do it.
And Will's expecting a whole truckload of folks from UMaine Augusta Senior College to go up there when the borders open up again. So
I'd love to go with you guys.
Well, we're thinking of going up to like Holton and Hodgson this summer to do some family history. I'd love at least to go to the border, to the shore and wave at those guys over there and say, hey, But yeah, and that was her place. That was her place. She could get away. She spent all that time up there by herself because Franklin was in D.C. doing work. Mama didn't come up there very much, so it meant something different to her than it did to him. And clearly, the pain of what happened to him there was too much for him to handle sometimes. So,
Yeah.
Anybody else? Kathy.
2 questions about the young Eleanor. Who in her family was progressive minded enough to facilitate her going to Allenswood? You maybe said that, but I missed it. And then also, why? Do you know why did Mama Sarah dislike her so much?
Because she was a threat to her boy, right?
So
Anybody would have been a threat to Mama. He's her boy. I mean, it's these mom. It's the same reason MacArthur had problems with his mother, and his mother lived at West Point with him for 4 years. She lived at the Thayer Hotel the entire 4 years she was at West Point, and she would say to him, he often had breakfast with her. She'd say, "Well, Douglas, your light was on last night, too late," thinking he was up studying or partying too late. And he's actually studying. Or, "Douglas, your light was out too early last night. You weren't studying hard enough." I mean, he loved his mother, but I mean, to have your mother move on campus with you, and I've been to West Point. To me, folks, it's not that far. I mean, that would be. We threatened that with Jonathan, but yeah, I don't think that's gonna happen. That's a great question, Kathy. I don't know. I would think there would be some of Teddy's attitude in that, maybe in the family, because Roosevelts were pretty progressive in some senses, even before Teddy became president. The father was very much involved. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. in philanthropy. Let me look into that and find out, because clearly that's after her parents are dead. I think there's an aunt in there as well who has some progressive ideas and thinks this is a good thing to do. Let me look into that for next week. That's a really good question. Because she didn't come up with it on her own.
Okay.
So there had to be some connection.
But with Mama, it wasn't some objection to her family story or being an orphan or any of that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, well, can't you do any better? She's always remember the family, Franklin. She's not that good looking. And that had to come up a little bit. But I think any woman that showed up, part of the problem is also Mama didn't have control. Franklin said to her, "Hey, by the way, I've been seeing Eleanor for a while. We're going to get married." And Mama was like, "What?" As opposed to the proper channel, which is to go and say, "Mama, I'd like to date so-and-so." I remember in college, there was a girl I had a fancy for. My mom, "Who's the girl?" Like, "Well, that's her over there." "Well, she's very cute." And I go, "Well, Mom signed off. I don't want to deal with her anymore." When I met Amy's folks, I moved to Wyoming from Minnesota, and I met her mom, her grandparents, her aunts and uncle, and all her cousins on one day. And there's a muster you have to pass, and I passed clearly because I'm still around. But I think it was more just that she was not something she wanted anyone would have been struck, but how Franklin presented it to her. She had no control over it, and he told her so. And I think, but clearly, when he betrays Eleanor, Mama sees some kind of lost soul that she empathizes with, and I think that picture we saw is very telling of her hand on her support. Yes, Nancy.
Hello.
There you go.
Lady who ran the school in Allenswood,
Yep.
Madam.
Silvestre, yeah.
What was her last name?
Silvestre.
I'm sorry.
Silvestre. It's a French. I don't know my French. Let me look if I can.
S-Y-L.
No, it's not in that book. But you have a question? Is that what you wanted to know? What her name was?
Yeah, I wanted to know her name, and also I wanted to know the name of the person who wrote Problem from Hell.
Samantha Power wrote that book as
She
well.
wrote that one too?
Yep.
Yeah, I've seen her she's been on some of the talk shows, the evening talk shows.
Oh, and Madame Silvestre,
Samantha
she
Power.
died a couple years after Eleanor left. She died in 1905. That she wasn't around much longer, but she was, as Wikipedia says, and this is the first place to start. She was a female educator who sought to develop independent minds in young women. She founded a school in France, and when she left that school, she founded the Allenswood Academy in London. Let's see how long that place was around. Allenswood closed in 1950. Notable alumni. Eleanor Roosevelt's the first one you probably know of. There's an Alsop in there, Alsop Megan Lloyd George, who I believe is Lloyd George's daughter. So yeah, it's a pretty prestigious place, but I'll look to find out how. It's somewhere in the book, and I read it and I just didn't put the notes down why it was Allenswood came up as a place for her to go. Maybe they thought they're getting her out of here for a while, she'll learn this stuff and it'll all get out of her head. And a lot of times if you were in a family situation where people thought you needed some rest and relaxation or to clear your head, they would send you overseas. That's how they did things back then. If they could afford it, people back in the day. They did that to Joe Kennedy when he and Rose were first dating, and her father didn't want him to marry her to marry Joe, so she sent her to a convent in Belgium for a year. Didn't work. They came back and still got married. And the rest, as they say, is history. But I'll check into that, Kat. That's a really great question. Anything else? All right, next week is the last week. We will have, what I really want to talk about is legacy. What can the Roosevelts teach us going forward? We'll talk a little bit about their kids, because their kids make the parents look like they're Sunday school people. I think there's 19 marriages between the 5 of them. That's crazy.
Yeah.
But clearly there's some pent up life lessons they're not learning at some point.
Yeah.
And all the boys serve in the war to varying degrees. And Anna stays as kind of a hostess because her mother's never home, so she kind of fills in as hostess for her father at times. It's a very unique family. And there are Roosevelts around today that are still active in public service and things like that. I mean, alone, can you imagine if your name was just Roosevelt? And why would you like Roosevelt? Oh, that's gonna be the first thing people say. Related to Teddy? Related to Franklin? Because it's become that name now. It's like you say that Kennedy. Oh, So, all right, everyone. Enjoy your. Supposed to be some rain coming later on today. That's good. We need some moisture a little bit. Stay out of trouble. Especially you, Irene. I'm looking at you because you're just a troublemaker. Yeah, see that look. Enjoy yourselves. Stay out of trouble. I think we've turned the corner a little bit. I think we're seeing some things are brightening up, and that's good. We'll get through this. As our friend Mr. Crocker says, stay safe and be kind to each other. Oh yeah.
Right.
And Mike,
Be good.
thank you.
Good week. Yep.
Yep.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.